I mean, he, for many of those children and adults, was the first white man they'd ever seen. People didn't quite know where he came from. They had no experience really of the outside world. But the story had only been told from the scientist's perspective. Carleton Gajdusek was a pediatrician and a virologist who won the Nobel Prize in 1976 for his work on a disease called kuru, which was only seen in the eastern highlands of Papua New Guinea. One of their traditions was that when people died, the women and the children would take part in these mortuary feasts where there was cannibalism practiced. A few anthropologists who were in the region felt that it must be linked to cannibalism somehow. Eventually, Gajdusek tried to inject brain matter from kuru victims into primates, and he discovered that it was transmissible. It sort of represented a new kind of illness because people could be infected or exposed to the disease and they wouldn't get it for years or even decades later, and that was a pretty new pattern in biology. Over the course of 30 years, he brought 36 children from Papua New Guinea and from Micronesia back to Frederick, Maryland, and lived in this 18th century estate that was very isolated. I think the sort of formal explanation was that he was allowing them to get an education in America and that, in theory, they would come back and sort of lift their people. Other times he had different explanations, which was that it was sort of an anthropological experiment. At the NIH, he had a lab that was specifically devoted to studying children from what was called primitive cultures then. These eminent scientists spoke about this project as if it were this fascinating study where you would bring up this wild child raised in the forest and see if he could adapt to civilization. He described the boys as orchids of human culture, never to be seen again. I was reading through all the children's correspondence at the National Library of Medicine. And in one of the correspondence files, I saw that there was a journal kept by a man named Louis when he was in middle school and high school that kind of described, suburban American life from the perspective of an outsider. You could also see the tensions in his relationship with Gajdusek in the sense that Louis would kind of run outside and write in his journal, I pretended I was a boy in a cave, or, Carleton called him a savage. I could see him seeing his own life through the lens of these Western scientists. Gajdusek's entire research project was motivated, I think, by his sexual desires. I think he wanted to study cultures that had no access to Western civilization because it was there and only there that he could be a pedophile without consequence. And so I think it was pretty purposeful and conscious that he went out looking for diseases in communities where there were children who didn't have the same sense of laws and the same sense of religious tradition. His sexuality was sort of impossible to separate from his research project. What was strange is that everyone felt like he had done this incredibly altruistic thing by taking these children into his home and funding their education. And there's even a passage in his journal where he says, all of my colleagues, all these people are telling me how altruistic I am. I feel much more comfortable when people are suspicious and wonder what my real motives are. I think once he won the Nobel Prize, he was kind of untouchable. One dynamic I was not aware of before was that Nobel laureates get to nominate other Nobel laureates, which, in addition to the Nobel Prize, creates this environment where people are currying favor with you. And everyone wanted to work in his lab, and his lab kept growing. He kept these guest books filled with names of the greatest scientists of the era. They'd write these letters about how inspired they were about this community of children that he had created. And yeah, he starts writing about his pedophilia stuff more and more throughout the course of his career. By his last journals, before he dies, he's just listing the boys that he, quote, had sex with. More than his own openness, what was striking is that even some of his earlier journals were not private journals. They were being sent to hundreds of his colleagues. They were being typed up by staff at the NIH. 2 months before he died, he wrote in his journal, "Without protectors, I would have never succeeded." And he then proceeded to list, eminent scientists who he felt knew about his pedophilia and ultimately didn't care. But there was a junior scientist in Gajdusек's lab named Mark Godek, and he was there for 5 years. He read Gajdusek's journals and was alarmed by the sexualized descriptions of young boys and this sort of false idea that they were flirting with Gajdusek that was written in the journals. And Mark Godek eventually brought those journals, marking them up with Post-it notes, to a senator who helped to initiate an investigation. And so the FBI began interviewing. Only one person spoke freely. And so he secretly recorded a conversation with Gajdusek in which he asked him these really kind of searching, earnest questions, like, why did you do this? And Gajdusek was very open, said, "I am a pedophile" on the recorded interview. And it was that conversation that led to Gajdusek's arrest. Throughout Gajdusek's journals, he talks about how he doesn't like what he calls a denouement, like what happens when these children came back to Papua New Guinea. I knew that I wanted to try to find Louis. First I was struck by the devotion that the boys felt towards this man who had taken them to America. Louis's experience sounded painful, but when he reflects back on it, he describes it as this wonderful, dreamy time where everything was possible. I think the dynamic that one sees in many situations of sexual abuse where you're abused by someone that you maybe respect or admire and who lavished attention on you, some of which felt good and some of which didn't, and it's very hard to sort of separate the unwanted attention that harmed you from the attention that kind of made you the person you are. And I felt that was particularly acute with some of these children who had been given access to a world that they never would have encountered. I felt like a lot of the people I talked to were not ready to categorize what had happened as abuse. The first time I talked to Louis, I was sort of ready to ask him questions about the experience of being abused, sexually abused, and he was more interested in talking about the implications of being the site of sort of the world's research and what that meant for the people there and what it felt like to be a research subject. And in our first conversation, he said to me, they took what they wanted and they left us with an empty bowl.